In the last section, we made an HTTP request to Google servers and then printed the response out at our terminal. Now, this is the data that represents the actual information around the request, but it doesn't actually contain the body of the request, which is what I really want to print out. Now, the body of the request should be a bunch of HTML that represents the actual google.com homepage. And so that's what we're really looking for here. We're looking for a bunch of HTML. And clearly, we don't see it just yet. So I think we still need to do a little bit of work to figure out how to print out the body. So let's flip back over to our code editor. I want to look up the documentation around this http.get function and see if we can't figure out how to use it to print out the response body. Okay, so back here, we'll find our function get. So we call get, we pass in the URL that we want to fetch, and then we get back two values. The first is a pointer to a response object. So remember, the star here means a pointer. So let's click on this response thing and see exactly what we're dealing with. So that response thing is actually a struct that contains a bunch of information about the response that came back to us. And so we can see different fields inside of here, like status, that is a string, status code, that's an int, and proto, that's a string. And as a matter of fact, if we flip over to our terminal and check out the first three fields on here, you'll see that we have 200, OK 200, and HTTP 1.1. And so those first three fields match these three fields right here. We have 200 OK, we have the status code of 200, and we have proto of HTTP 1.1. The docs show 1.0, but hey, we're close enough. So clearly we are logging out a struct right now that is being returned to us from that http.get function. So let's look at some of the other fields on here and figure out if we can't decide exactly how to log out the body. So right here, hey, sure enough, body represents the response body. Surely this is what we want to use to get the actual HTML out of that response. Now, if we look at this body property, you'll notice that it has a type of io.readCloser. Remember, that's how all these different structs are set up. We get the name of the field and then the type that it's supposed to be. So in this case, the body is something of type readCloser. Now, if we were working with a lot of other languages, and definitely like Ruby and JavaScript comes to mind, the body of the response is usually just a blob of text, or maybe some JSON or whatever it might be. Just something that very clearly represents the body of the response. But here with Go, clearly that's not the case. Clearly this is something a little bit more complicated. So let's click on readCloser right here and figure out exactly what type this body property, this body field is supposed to be. And so when we click on it, we can see very quickly that this readCloser thing is actually an interface. Well, that's kind of interesting. And we have definitely not spoken about types on a struct being an interface just yet. So that's something we're definitely going to have to talk about. The other thing that you'll notice that's pretty interesting is that the syntax of this interface looks very different than some of the syntax we've been looking at already. So I see reader and closer right here, and we've been saying constantly, we had said that interface syntax should list out all the different functions and their return types on here. But this doesn't really look like some function that's written out, but it is clickable, so let's click on it. And so when I click on reader, we then go to some more documentation. And if we scroll down a little bit here, you'll finally see an actual interface definition that you and I are used to, based on the one that we just worked on a little bit ago. So it says type reader is an interface. It needs to define a read function that accepts a slice of bytes and returns an int and an array. Okay, so this looks familiar to me. Now, as you can very quickly tell here, based on all these clicking through that we're doing, as soon as you start diving into the documentation, you start to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. In other words, you can keep clicking on links and types here for a long time before you get to anything that starts to make any sense. So I took the liberty of kind of already clicking through this readCloser thing, clicking through reader and closer, and just kind of tabulating all together and putting together a diagram that represents exactly what we're working with. So here it is. Now, yeah, it looks a little bit crazy, but hey, we'll get around to everything inside of it. So on the very far left, we have something that represents the underlying response struct. So it has fields like status, status code, and body. So I first want to start by talking about exactly what it means to say that a field inside of a struct can be an interface, because that definitely doesn't quite line up with a lot of stuff that we've been discussing around structs already. After that, we'll then talk about exactly what syntax we saw when we saw that read closer thing. So specifically this right here. This definitely does not look like the syntax we had been looking at previously around interfaces. Now, it's going to take a minute to talk about all this stuff, so let's take a quick break. We'll come back in the next section and start talking about the interface here and the syntax around the read closer interface as well. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.